History is usually told like a road. A long road stretching from the first fires in forgotten caves to the towers of modern cities. One step after another. One invention leading to the next. Stone becomes bronze. Bronze becomes iron. Villages become kingdoms. Kingdoms become empires. We imagine progress as something steady, almost natural, as if once humanity learns something important, that knowledge can never truly be lost again. But history does not move like a road. It moves like a coastline after a storm. Whole sections disappear. Familiar landmarks are swallowed. What looked permanent turns fragile. What seems certain becomes mystery. And if you stand at the edge of the ancient world and look carefully, you begin to notice something deeply unsettling. Some of the brightest civilizations ever built did not slowly fade. They did not gently pass their wisdom to those who came after them. They collapsed so completely that later generations barely remembered they had existed at all. Tonight we begin with one of the greatest disappearances of all, the Bronze Age collapse. To understand how shocking it was, you first have to understand what the world looked like before the fall. Imagine the Eastern Mediterranean around the 13th century BCE. The sea is crowded with merchant ships. Ports are full of voices speaking many languages. Bronze weapons gleam in palace armories. Scribes bend over clay tablets, recording shipments, taxes, marriages, treaties, grain, cattle, copper, tin, olive oil, perfume, slaves, tribute, and war. This was not a primitive world. It was organized, wealthy, international, and astonishingly connected. In Egypt, the pharaoh ruled over one of the most powerful states on earth. Along the Nile rose temples so vast that even now they make visitors feel small. Stone columns painted in bright colors. Sacred lakes reflecting torchlight. Storehouses packed with grain. Officials tracking harvests with practiced precision. Egypt had endured for centuries and looked eternal. To the north stood the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, a military and diplomatic giant. Their kings negotiated treaties, managed provinces, moved armies, and fought rivals with disciplined force. They understood statecraft. They understood logistics. They understood power. Across the sea, the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece flourished behind fortified citadels. Their palaces stored bronze, textiles, oil, and weapons. Their rulers commanded labor, controlled trade, and celebrated warriors whose echoes may later have become the heroes of epic legend. On Crete, the memory of older Minoan greatness still lingered in palaces and ports. In the Levant, coastal cities traded constantly, linking continents together. Cyprus shipped copper. Distant lands sent luxury goods. Carthage crossed deserts. Ships crossed dangerous waters. Tin traveled from far away because bronze itself depended on it. Without copper and tin meeting in the right furnace, much of this world could not function. And that is what made it magnificent, and what made it vulnerable. Because this civilization was not one empire. It was many powers tied together like threads in a net. If one strand snapped, the pressure shifted to the others. If several snapped at once, the whole thing could tear apart. For generations, it did not. Kings wrote to one another as brothers. Gifts crossed borders. Princesses were married for alliances. Craftsmen specialized in rare skills. Scribes mastered writing systems ordinary people never learned. Cities expanded. Populations grew. Walls rose higher. Granaries grew fuller. It must have felt, to those living in it, like the center of the world had finally become stable. Then, in what may have been little more than a human lifetime, the lights went out. We know this because the ground remembers even when writing does not. Archaeologists dig through layers of earth like readers, turning pages. In many places, the page for this moment is black with ash. Cities burned. At Hattusa, capital of the Hittites, destruction came so fiercely that parts of the city were never truly restored. At Ugarit, once a wealthy trading center, letters were left unfinished. At Mycenaean sites in Greece, palaces that had managed whole regions were destroyed or abandoned. At Pylos, Tablets suggest emergency preparations shortly before the end. Watchers were posted. Resources were counted carefully. Something was feared. Then silence. At site after site around the eastern Mediterranean, the same pattern appears. Fire, ruin, sudden abandonment, shrinking populations, broken trade, forgotten scripts. This is what makes the Bronze Age collapse so haunting. It was not one city falling to one enemy, and no surviving witness gives us a clear explanation. Imagine living through that. Imagine hearing that caravans never arrived this year, then hearing that a neighboring kingdom has fallen, then hearing that raiders have struck the coast, then drought ruins the harvest, then taxes rise because the army must be fed, then refugees appear at the gates, then merchants vanish, then bronze becomes scarce, then the palace demands more labor, then rumors spread that another city burns in the night. At what point would you realize the world itself was ending? One of the most famous clues comes from Egypt, where inscriptions describe attacks by groups modern historians call the Sea Peoples. They are shown arriving with ships, warriors, families, ox carts. Not just invaders perhaps, but entire populations in motion. Egyptian records name several groups, but names in ancient inscriptions are slippery things. We do not know exactly who these people were. We do not know whether they came from the Aegean, Anatolia, the Central Mediterranean, or many places at once. We do not know whether they were conquerors, migrants, refugees, mercenaries, or all of these depending on the group. What we do know is that Egyptian rulers consider them dangerous enough to carve victories over them into temple walls. But here is the deeper mystery. Even if these sea-borne attackers were real and devastating, were they the cause of collapse or one result of collapse already underway? When societies break, people move. When food fails, people move. When kingdoms fall, soldiers become raiders. When ports close, sailors turn desperate. The Sea Peoples may have been the hammer that struck weakened walls, or they may have been people fleeing disasters elsewhere, carrying the chaos with them. Then there's climate. Ancient pollen, lake sediments, and tree rings suggest periods of drought affected parts of the region around this time. That matters more than it sounds. A few failed harvests in a modern world are painful. In an ancient world, repeated crop failures could destroy everything. No grain means hunger. Hunger means unrest. Unrest means rebellion, migration, banditry, and weakened armies. Weak armies invite invasion. And yet drought alone feels too simple. Civilizations had survived hard years before. Egypt especially knew how to manage lean times better than many neighbors. So perhaps drought was not the single cause. Perhaps it was one pressure among many. Then comes the idea that feels strangely modern. Systems collapse. The Bronze Age world was efficient because it was interconnected. But efficiency often removes slack. It depends on things arriving on time, routes staying open, officials doing their jobs, harvests being adequate, trust remaining intact. If bronze depends on distant tin, and trade routes fail, weapons production suffers. If cities depend on imported grain, and ships stop coming, urban life becomes unstable. If rulers depend on taxes from struggling farmers, state authority weakens. If every kingdom is already strained, then one collapse spreads to another. The very sophistication of the age may have made it brittle. There are even scholars who point to earthquakes. The Eastern Mediterranean sits in a restless geological zone. Some sites show signs that may fit seismic destruction. A chain of earthquakes over decades could damage cities, walls, roads, and morale. But again, earthquakes alone do not explain everything. So what happened? Perhaps that is the wrong question. Perhaps we should ask what happens when several disasters arrive together. A drought reduces food. Earthquakes damage cities. Trade falters. States demand more from exhausted people. Mercenary forces rebel. Refugees move. Raiders attack. Neighboring powers, already weakened, cannot help. One palace falls, then another, then another. Soon no one is strong enough to stabilize anything. And then the scribes stop writing. That last part may be the most tragic. When a city burns, buildings can be rebuilt. When a dynasty falls, another may rise. But when literacy itself contracts, memory dies. In Mycenaean Greece, the linear B script used for administration vanished. For centuries afterward, Greece had no comparable writing system. Think about that. Descendants walked among ruins built by ancestors whose records they could no longer read. Imagine inheriting a library in a language no one understands. Imagine living beside shattered halls no one remembers how to organize. Imagine hearing stories of a golden past, so grand it sounds like myth. That is what happened in many places. The world became smaller. Long-distance trade shrank dramatically. Monumental buildings slowed or ceased in several regions. Populations dropped. People relocated to villages and defensible hilltops. Craft production simplified. International diplomacy faded. The great conversation between kingdoms ended because there were fewer kingdoms left to speak. And yet humanity did not end. That matters. The survivors farmed. They repaired tools. They adapted. Children were born who never knew the old world. New customs formed. New languages shifted. New powers slowly emerged from the wreckage. But recovery was slow. Very slow. In Greece, centuries passed before writing returned in a new form adapted from the Phoenician alphabet. The civilization that later gave rise to philosophers, playwrights, and city-states was not a direct continuation of the palace world that had burned. It was something new grown from old ashes. The Hittite Empire never truly returned. Egypt survived, but diminished from its earlier dominance. Phoenician traders expanded in time, carrying letters and goods across the sea. Iron technology spread more widely, changing warfare and production. The map of the ancient world was redrawn. That is another strange lesson of collapse. The end of one order can become the beginning of another. But for those trapped inside the transition, there is no grand perspective, only uncertainty. Picture a family in a coastal town hearing rumors of raiders. Picture a scribe pressing wet clay with practice signs, not knowing his tablet will be the last record of his office. Picture a merchant waiting for ships that never arrive. Picture a child growing up in the shell of a city, playing beside walls built before anyone can remember. History often celebrates builders. It loves founders, conquerors, inventors, kings. But most humans who ever lived were not founders of glorious ages. They were survivors of difficult ones. And the survivors of the Bronze Age collapse carried humanity through one of its darkest transitions with almost no recognition because they left so few records behind. That absence is why the collapse feels eerie even now. We can excavate burned stones. We can read fragments. We can compare pottery and pollen and skeletons and harbor layers. But the lived experience, the fear, confusion, rumors, grief, stubborn resilience, is mostly gone. No camera captured the empty docks. No historian stood in every city. No voice tells us exactly when people understood the old world was not coming back. Maybe they never did. Maybe each year simply felt worse than the last until a generation arrived that accepted the smaller world as normal. That can happen faster than we think. Civilization feels solid when we stand inside it. Roads seem permanent. Supply lines seem invisible and reliable. Expertise seems endless. We assume someone knows how everything works. But ancient ruins whisper another truth. Systems are maintained by people. Knowledge survives because it is taught. Order lasts because enough institutions function at once. And when too many fail together, even magnificent worlds can dissolve. Somewhere in the centuries lost after the collapse were inventions we will never identify, poems never written down, treaties forgotten, songs unheard, names erased forever. We remember the destruction because ruins survive. We do not remember the quiet courage required to continue afterward. That courage built the future. Because eventually ships sailed again. Markets returned. Letters were written. Cities grew. Stories were told of heroes from a half-remembered age, perhaps inspired by real palaces and real wars buried beneath legend. And when later Greeks sang of bronze-clad warriors and mighty citadels, They may have been hearing echoes of a world that had already vanished for centuries. That is how history sometimes survives. Not as records, as ghosts. And the Bronze Age collapse is one of the greatest ghosts of all. A reminder that progress is not guaranteed, that complexity can become weakness, and that entire chapters of human achievement can disappear so completely that we spend thousands of years trying to guess what happened. But this was only one darkness. Because after the ancient Mediterranean lost its first great world, another empire would rise in the West, stretch roads across continents, fill libraries, raise stone cities, and convince millions that order had become permanent. Then Rome would fall, and once again, people would wake to find that the structures around them still stood, while the knowledge that sustained them was slipping away. Picture a traveler walking through Europe in the years after the Western Roman Empire fell. He passes along a road paved with fitted stone, still smoother than many roads that would exist for centuries afterward. He crosses bridges built by engineers whose names are forgotten. He enters towns enclosed by walls raised generations earlier. He sees aqueduct arches cutting across the horizon. Baths, forums, villas, warehouses, temples turned churches, milestones, drains, cisterns, harbors, towers. The bones of empire are everywhere. And yet something essential is gone. The buildings remain, but the system that fed them has weakened. The roads exist, but fewer people travel them. The walls stand, but fewer officials guard the gates. Documents survive in chests and libraries, but fewer readers can understand them. It is like walking through the shell of a giant creature after the creature itself has died. When people imagine the fall of Rome, they often imagine one dramatic moment. A barbarian king enters the city. An emperor is deposed. A flag comes down. Civilization ends before sunset. Reality was stranger. The Western Empire did not collapse in a single day. It unraveled. Provinces slipped away. Armies became unreliable. Taxes became harder to collect. Rival generals fought one another. Frontiers weakened. Migrating peoples crossed borders, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as allies, often as both. Cities strained under pressure. Authority fragmented. By the time the last Western emperor was removed in 476 CE, much had already been changing for generations. But symbols matter. Later ages would look back on that moment and say Rome had fallen. The more haunting truth is that many people living through it may not have realized they were crossing into a new age at all. A farmer still had to plow fields. A mother still had to feed children. A blacksmith still had to repair tools. A bishop still had to settle disputes. Life continued, but underneath ordinary routines, the great machine of Roman civilization was losing parts faster than they could be replaced. Rome was not merely a territory. It was infrastructure. Grain moved from North Africa, wine from one region, oil from another. Taxes from many lands funded soldiers who protected roads that enabled merchants whose trade supported cities, whose wealth sustained administration that organized everything else. Take enough pressure off one wheel, and the machine shudders. Break several at once, and it begins to grind itself apart. One of the clearest signs of change was urban decline. Roman cities that depended on flows of food and money larger than local farmland alone could often support. Public baths required maintenance. Aqueducts required repair. Streets required labor. Officials required salaries. Markets required safe movement of goods. Once these systems weakened, city life became harder to sustain. So population shrank. Some people died in wars, famines, and disease. Many others simply moved. Why remain in a struggling town when land in the countryside might offer direct access to food and security through local ties? The ancient urban world contracted, not everywhere equally, but enough to transform Europe. This matters because cities are storage batteries for specialization. In a large city, one person can devote life to copying texts, another to surveying land, another to masonry, another to law, another to medicine, another to managing accounts. Dense populations support professions that villages cannot. When cities shrink, specialists disappear. And when specialists disappear, complex knowledge becomes fragile. Consider literacy. Modern people often treat reading and writing as universal skills. In the Roman world, literacy existed on a spectrum and was never equally distributed. But it was still deeply tied to administration, commerce, military command, law, and elite culture. There were scribes, notaries, teachers, clerks, accountants, secretaries, and officials whose daily work depended on text. If fewer bureaucracies function, fewer such jobs exist. If fewer jobs exist, fewer families invest years training children for them. If fewer trained readers remain, books decay unread. Within surprisingly little time, literacy can narrow from a practical tool of society into the guarded skill of smaller groups. That is exactly what happened in many regions. It did not vanish everywhere. It retreated, and in retreat, it changed the shape of memory itself. Imagine entering an abandoned Roman villa a century after its owners are gone. Mosaic floors cracked by weeds. Roof collapsed inward. Marble stripped for reuse. A bronze hinge removed for melting. A fine statue buried in rubble. Nearby, villagers quarry cut stone because stone is precious and easier to take from ruins than carve anew. This scene repeated across parts of the former empire. To later romantics, it looks tragic. To the people doing it, it was practical. Ruins were resources. A shattered temple becomes a church wall. A forum becomes pasture. An amphitheater becomes a fortified enclosure. An imperial bath becomes a quarry. Civilization was not vanishing into emptiness. It was being recycled into new forms. Yet losses were real. Roman concrete techniques declined in some areas. Large-scale civic building reduced sharply in many Western regions. Standardized pottery industries changed. Long-distance commercial networks contracted. Coin circulation became patchier in certain places. Administrative habits, once spread across provinces, became local and inconsistent. The world grew more regional. And then came disease. In the 6th century, the plague associated with the reign of Emperor Justinian struck parts of the Mediterranean world. Historians debate exact mortality levels and regional effects. But there is little doubt epidemic disease added severe pressure to societies already adapting to centuries of transformation. Labor shortages, fear, disrupted trade, demographic shocks, all could deepen instability. When people are hungry, sickness spreads faster. When institutions are weakened, recovery slows. When records are sparse, suffering becomes harder to measure, but no less real. This is one reason these centuries feel dark to us. Not because nothing happened, but because fewer people were positioned to record what happened in durable forms. A grand Roman governor might leave archives. A village elder repairing fences usually does not. Yet most human history belongs to village elders, farmers, shepherds, mothers, laborers, craftsmen, monks, and migrants whose names never entered formal chronicle. So we peer into the early medieval centuries through fragments. A law code here, a letter there, a saint's life full of miracles but wrapped around genuine details. Burial goods in agrave, seeds in a storage pit, animal bones showing diet, post holes where timber halls once stood, charred grain from a burned settlement. The puzzle pieces survive. The voices often do not. Take Britain, one of the most dramatic examples. Under Rome, Britain had towns, roads, villas, bathhouses, forts, coinage, and links to continental trade. After Roman administration withdrew in the early 5th century, patterns changed sharply. Some towns declined dramatically. Coin use dwindled. Imported goods became scarcer. Villas were abandoned or repurposed. New groups from the continent arrived or expanded influence. Power shifted into smaller kingdoms whose stories blend archaeology and legend. This is the world from which tales of Arthur later emerged. Not a clear age of shining castles, but a murky landscape of fractured authority, war bands, hill forts, local rulers, and communities trying to survive amid change. Was it chaos everywhere? No. Was it continuity everywhere? Also no. That is what frustrates historians. The old map of civilization and barbarism does not fit. Some regions preserved more Roman habits than others. Parts of Italy retained urban life. Southern Gaul showed continuity. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium, remained a major power for centuries after the West fragmented. In Ireland, monasteries flourished despite never having been Roman. In Spain, Visigothic rule created its own institutions. In Frankish lands, new dynasties rose. There was no single darkness. There were many local dawns and dusks overlapping. Still, one institution became especially important in preserving knowledge: the church. As secular administrative structures weakened in parts of the West, bishops and monasteries often became centers of literacy, storage, dispute resolution, charity, and continuity. Monks copied manuscripts by hand. Scripture, theology, grammar, law, and sometimes classical texts survived because someone in a cold room with ink-stained fingers believed copying mattered. It is difficult to overstate the importance of this labor. Every manuscript copied by hand was time made visible. Weeks, months, sometimes years of work. A mistake scraped away. A page dried. A binding repaired. A candle burned low. Because of such efforts, works by Virgil, Cicero, portions of Tacitus, and many others survived the centuries. But preservation was selective. Texts considered useful or valuable had better chances. Others vanished. We know some ancient works only because later authors mentioned them. Entire histories, plays, philosophies, scientific treatises gone. Titles remain like gravestones with no bodies beneath them. Sometimes scarcity created cruel choices. Writing material could be expensive. Old parchment might be scraped and reused, creating palimpsests. Beneath later religious writing, modern technology has occasionally recovered erased older texts. Imagine discovering a forgotten voice hidden under another voice for 1,000 years. How many others remain unread forever? And yet if we focus only on loss, we miss the creative side of these centuries. New languages matured from spoken Latin into early forms of French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, and others. Germanic languages evolved. New legal traditions formed. New art styles emerged. New kingdoms experimented with rule and identity. Agricultural practices adapted. Social bonds reorganized around local lordship, kinship, and custom. The medieval world was not merely Rome in ruins. It was a different civilization being born. Birth, however, is messy. There were raids. There were famines. There were succession crises. There were winters no chronicle bothered to describe. There were villages erased by flood or feud. Then from the north came another force that would later dominate imagination: the Vikings. Beginning in the late 8th century, Scandinavian raiders, traders, settlers, and explorers burst into written record through attacks, such as the raid on Lindisfarne in 793. Monasteries were vulnerable, wealthy, and symbolically powerful targets, so their chroniclers remembered these events vividly. But the Viking story is larger than raiding. They crossed rivers deep into Eastern Europe. They traded with the Islamic world. They founded towns. They settled Iceland, reached Greenland, and touched North America centuries before Columbus. Their ships were marvels of design, flexible, swift, capable in ocean and river alike. How do they navigate? Likely through experience, landmarks, stars, sun position, sea behavior, birds, memory, and techniques only partly recoverable now. Again, we face the same pattern. Achievements survive an outcome. Methods are partly shadowed. The people who knew exactly how things were done often did not leave manuals for us. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Europe, change accelerated. The Carolingian world under Charlemagne attempted renewed order in the 8th and 9th centuries. Schools were encouraged. Script was standardized into clearer handwriting. Administrative reform revived certain literate practices. Scholars moved between courts and monasteries. This was not a return to Rome. It was proof that the lights had never gone out entirely. They had flickered, moved, concentrated in pockets, and begun to spread again. That may be the best way to understand these so-called Dark Ages. not as one long night, but as a landscape after storm damage where some fires were extinguished, others smoldered, and new ones slowly caught. Still, the gaps remain immense. We do not know the names of countless local rulers. We cannot reconstruct most ordinary conversations. We cannot map every migration. We cannot hear the song sung in timber halls now reduced to stains in the soil. We cannot fully trace how Roman peasants became medieval peasants, how soldiers became nobles, how tax districts became lordships, how abandoned bathhouses became legends of giants. The transformation happened, but much of the process vanished between surviving documents. That is what makes absence so powerful in history. Silence is not emptiness. Silence often means millions lived lives no archive preserved. Think of a child born in Gaul around 400 CE and a child born there around 900 CE. The language around them changed. The political world changed. Religion deepened into daily structure. The shape of warfare changed. The architecture of authority changed. Even the mental map of the world changed. And between those two children lies half a millennium we can only partly see. Yet perhaps there is comfort in that. Because if people could endure the fragmentation of empire, the loss of institutions, the narrowing of horizons, and still build new worlds from old stones, then collapse is never the whole story. Humans are not only destroyers. We are rebuilders. We inherit ruins and make homes among them. We lose libraries and create songs. We forget empires and invent villages, kingdoms, cathedrals, universities, and futures no fallen emperor could imagine. Still, the warning remains. Knowledge does not float above society untouched. It depends on teachers, materials, stability, incentives, and communities that believe preservation matters. Remove enough supports, and even advanced systems can fade with alarming speed. Roads crack, archives mold, skills die with practitioners. Languages shift beyond recognition, and descendants stand among magnificent remains wondering who built them. That happened after Rome. The stones endured longer than the structure of understanding behind them. But Europe was only one chapter in the shadows between histories. Across the ocean, entire cities would rise to greatness, align themselves with stars, move mountains of earth, carve homes into cliffs, command trade across vast distances, and then vanish so completely that later newcomers would walk through their remains with no clear memory of who had lived there. If you had stood somewhere in the Americas 1,000 years ago, you would not have been standing in an empty wilderness. That image, the untouched continent, the endless forest waiting for discovery, the silent plains without history, was one of the most successful misunderstandings ever created. It survived for centuries because so much had already been erased by the time outsiders began describing what they saw. But the land remembers what people forget. Under forests, beneath fields, beside rivers, under modern towns, hidden in deserts, and buried under mounds of earth, the evidence remains. Roads, canals, platforms, temples, causeways, plazas, irrigation works, defensive walls, house foundations, graves, pottery, trade goods, sacred objects, human bones carrying the signatures of diet, migration, and disease. They tell a very different story. Before European contact, the Americas were home to tens of millions of people, not scattered aimlessly, but living in communities ranging from mobile societies expertly adapted to landscape, to agricultural towns, to ceremonial centers, to powerful cities with planned spaces and monumental architecture. There were diplomats, traders, astronomers, farmers, builders, rulers, priests, artists, navigators, engineers, storytellers, and laborers. There were alliances and rivalries, markets and rituals, memory and ambition. And then, in many regions, catastrophe arrived so quickly and so completely that later generations inherited ruins with broken chains of explanation. To feel the scale of that loss, begin in the center of North America, near the meeting place of mighty rivers, not far from modern St. Louis, rose a city now called Cahokia. Many people today, have never heard the name. That alone should unsettle you, because around the 11th century CE, Cahokia may have been the largest urban center north of Mexico. At its height, thousands lived in and around it. Some estimates place the wider population far higher when surrounding settlements are included. It was not a random cluster of huts. It was organized space on a grand scale. At its center stood Monk's Mound, an immense earthen platform rising above the plain. Millions of cubic feet of earth were moved by human hands, basket by basket, load by load, season after season. Around it spread plazas, neighborhoods, workshops, ceremonial spaces, and wooden structures aligned with celestial events. Massive timber circles, sometimes called wood hinges, marked solar positions. Palisades enclosed core areas. Roads and pathways linked districts. This required planning. This required authority. This required labor systems, food surpluses, technical knowledge, and a shared vision strong enough to mobilize many people toward common projects. Yet no native written chronicle from Cahokia survives to tell us who ordered these works, how power was negotiated, what festivals filled the plazas, what songs rose at dawn, what disputes shook its leadership, or how ordinary families understood the city they lived in. We have the city. We lack its voice. Trade networks connected Cahokia to distant regions. Marine shell from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, stone from far sources. Exotic materials traveled hundreds of miles through relationships we only partly understand. Goods moved, but ideas likely moved with them. Ritual symbols, styles, stories, technologies, alliances. And then something changed. By the 14th century, Cahokia declined and was largely abandoned. No single invading empire clearly destroyed it. No final dramatic battle explains everything. Instead, scholars debate multiple pressures: environmental strain, flooding, drought, political conflict, social fragmentation, resource depletion, disease, shifts in trade, spiritual crisis, or combinations of these. The familiar pattern returns. Complex systems rarely collapse for one reason. Imagine generations cutting timber for walls and fuel. Imagine farmland pushed harder each year. Imagine leaders competing for legitimacy during lean harvests. Imagine factional tensión. Imagine floods remaking the landscape. Imagine trust weakening. A city can die long before the last person leaves. When Europeans later entered parts of the Mississippi Valley, they encountered indigenous societies with their own rich cultures and histories, but often without clear living memory of Cahokia as a functioning metropolis. Time, migration, conflict, and epidemic disease had severed many lines of transmission. A giant city had stood there. Then the story thinned into silence. Travel southeast, and the earth rises again. Across what is now the American South are mound centers built by societies often grouped under the label Mississippian cultures. Places like Moundville, Etowah, and Spiro reveal planned ceremonial landscapes, ranked societies, long-distance exchange, and artistic traditions of extraordinary sophistication. Copper plates hammered into symbolic forms. Carved shell gorgets. Ceremonial objects bearing cosmological imagery. These were not isolated anomalies. They were nodes in broad networks of power and meaning. Yet much of their political history is unrecoverable. Names of rulers are gone. Speeches vanished. Treaties dissolved into air. The monuments endure while biographies disappear. Move west into the dry lands of the Southwest, and another world emerges. There, among mesas, canyons, and desert skies, ancestral Puebloan societies created settlements that still astonish visitors. At places like Mesa Verde, rooms were built into cliff alcoves with elegant precision. At Chaco Canyon rose monumental great houses, multi-story complexes containing hundreds of rooms, carefully engineered masonry, roads, storage areas, and ceremonial spaces. Pueblo Bonito, one of the most famous, was vast by the standards of its time and place. Timber for construction came from distant mountains, requiring transport over long distances. Roads radiated outward, some remarkably straight, connecting communities across harsh terrain. Buildings aligned with solar and lunar cycles. Water management demanded intimate environmental knowledge. This was intelligence expressed in stone. And then, after centuries of flourishing, major Shikoan centers were largely abandoned. Again, the debates begin. Prolonged drought, deforestation, social stress, conflict, changing religious authority, migration, adaptation to new settlement patterns. Notice something important. Abandonment does not always mean failure. Sometimes people leave because staying no longer makes sense. Sometimes migration is strategy, not defeat. Descendant Pueblo communities preserve deep cultural continuities with ancestral peoples of the region. The story did not end. It changed form, but the exact sequence of decisions, crises, and journeys remains partly hidden. We can map roads. We cannot replay councils where leaders argued whether to remain or depart. We can date beams. We cannot hear the final prayers spoken in emptying plazas. Then there is Mesoamerica, where written records exist in greater quantity, yet destruction still carved enormous gaps. The Maya built cities across forests and lowlands, Tikal, Palenque, Copan, Calakmul, and many others. They developed sophisticated writing, mathematics including the concept of zero, detailed calendars, dynastic histories, astronomy, monumental art, and architecture rising above jungle canopies. For a long time, outsiders romanticized Maya ruins as evidence of a mysterious vanished race. The truth is more human and more interesting. Maya civilization did not simply disappear. Many Maya people survived, adapted, and live today in multiple communities with living languages and traditions. But the political collapse of many classic Maya city-states between the 8th and 9th centuries remains one of history's great transformations. Steely recording kingships cease in some places. Construction slows. Populations shift. Urban centers decline. Why? Warfare likely intensified. Drought episodes struck some regions. Ecological pressures mattered. Competitive kingship systems may have become unstable. Trade patterns shifted. As elsewhere, multiple stressors probably converged. Again, we see not one apocalypse, but a web of vulnerabilities tightening until established orders broke. Then came the 16th century, and with it, a catastrophe unlike anything before. When Europeans crossed the Atlantic, they did not arrive alone. Invisible passengers traveled with them. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and other diseases to which many indigenous populations had little or no prior exposure. Epidemics could move faster than armies, faster than missionaries, faster than maps. A ship lands on the coast. Trade carries objects inland. People carry pathogens unknowingly. Weeks later, villages far from any European sight line begin to sicken. Months later, leadership collapses in places the foreigners have never heard of. By the time explorers physically reach some interior regions, disease may already have torn through them. This matters because it changes the record. Early colonial observers often describe lands as sparsely populated or underused, but in some cases they were seeing landscapes after demographic shock, not before. Fields gone untended, political centers weakened, survivors regrouped elsewhere. Social memory fractured by grief. Imagine trying to reconstruct a city's culture after 90% of its people die within generations. Who teaches the children sacred genealogies? Who maintains irrigation works? Who remembers the old boundaries? Who carries oral epics if the elders are buried in haste? Who performs rituals requiring specialist knowledge? Knowledge can die without a library burning. It dies when communities are broken faster than they can transmit themselves. Some of the earliest European expeditions accidentally witnessed worlds in mid-collapse. Accounts from the southeastern United States, for example, describe populous towns and active agricultural landscapes in the 16th century. Later visitors found many of those same regions transformed. Settlements gone, polities altered, numbers reduced. The difference was not emptiness. It was devastation. And still the surprises keep coming. Modern technologies such as LiDAR, laser mapping from the air, have peeled back forests and revealed landscapes once hidden under vegetation. In the Amazon, long imagined by outsiders as primeval wilderness incapable of supporting dense societies, researchers have found earthworks, managed soils, road systems, settlements, fish weirs, orchards, and evidence of large-scale landscape engineering in multiple regions. This does not mean every acre held a city. It means human influence was deeper, older, and more varied than simplistic myths allowed. The forest itself may contain cultural memory shaped into ecology. Elsewhere, geophysical surveys reveal structures beneath fields long thought empty. Mounds once dismissed as natural prove ceremonial. Ancient canals reappear in drought years. Shorelines expose forgotten fish traps. Every decade adds evidence that the pre-contact Americas were more populous, more connected, and more innovative than many textbooks once admitted. Yet even as the map fills, the stories remain incomplete. Archaeology is powerful, but it has limits. A plaza tells us people gathered. It does not tell us whether they laughed nervously before speech. A grave reveals status objects. It does not reveal whether the dead ruler was loved or feared. A road shows movement. It does not preserve the argument that happened on the journey. A burned layer indicates violence. It does not record the names cried out in smoke. This is why the loss feels so profound. We are not merely missing dates. We are missing interior worlds. And yet not everything vanished. Indigenous communities across the Americas carry languages, ceremonies, agricultural knowledge, oral traditions, ecological expertise, and historical memory that survive conquest, displacement, and suppression. Sometimes scholars once ignored these sources because they did not fit European expectations of written evidence. That mistake is slowly being corrected. History is not stored only in ink. It can live in ritual, place names, weaving patterns, planning cycles, architecture, kinship structures, and stories told beside fires generation after generation. Still, colonization inflicted further erasures. Sacred objects were destroyed. Children were separated from languages. Communities were forcibly relocated. Archives were written about indigenous peoples rather than by them. Even when records survive, they often pass through the lens of conquerors. So we must read carefully. We must ask whose voice is speaking and whose is absent. The Americas before Columbus were not waiting rooms for European history. They were worlds already in motion. Their own rises and falls, inventions and crises, philosophies and rivalries, joys and griefs unfolded long before outsiders named the rivers. Some cities were abandoned centuries before contact. Some states were expanding when contact came. Some peoples thrived through mobility rather than monumentality. Some memories endure in descendants today, but countless details are gone forever. The name of the architect who aligned a mound to sunrise. The merchant who knew every river bend. The council that decided to move a town. The child who first climbed a new platform. The healer who faced the first epidemic without understanding what had entered the village. The elder who realized no one remained who remembered the old songs completely. These lives mattered as much as any emperor's. Their partial disappearance from written history is not proof they were less important. It is proof that archives are uneven and tragedy can erase brilliance. Whenever we stand before a mound in silence, or stare at cliff dwellings cut into stone, or watch jungle roots grip a temple stair, we are not looking at mystery because ancient Americans were unknowable. We're looking at mystery because so much was taken, and because what survives still refuses to fit simple stories. Yet another shadow between histories. Yet another reminder that the world has held greatness in places later ages failed to understand. And farther east, beyond deserts and mountains, another civilization built some of the most orderly cities on Earth, traded across vast distances, mastered water and planning, then vanished so completely that even its writing still stares back at us unread. There is a special kind of mystery reserved for places that speak clearly in every way except language. You walk their streets. You measure their walls. You hold their tools. You trace their trade routes. You study their skeletons, seeds, bricks, drains, wells, weights, ornaments, workshops, dockyards, and houses. You know they were real. You know they were sophisticated. You know they organized life on a massive scale. And yet when you ask them the most human questions, who ruled here? What did you call yourselves? What stories did parents tell children at night? What did you fear? What did you celebrate? Why did this world end? They answer with symbols no one can confidently read. That is the Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization after one of the first major sites excavated. It flourished roughly from the 3rd millennium BCE across parts of what are now Pakistan and northwest India. At its height, it covered an enormous area, larger than many contemporary Bronze Age civilizations, with settlements stretching across river plains, coasts, and interior zones. Its population likely numbered in the millions. Yet despite this scale, it remained hidden in plain sight for centuries. Ancient bricks from ruined Harappan cities were reused by later builders. Travelers passed mounds without knowing what lay beneath. Only in the modern era did excavation reveal that beneath dust and fields stood the remains of one of the world's earliest urban traditions. And what remains is astonishing. Begin with Mohenjo-Daro. Its name, given later, is often translated as Mound of the Dead, though the city itself once pulsed with life. Streets were laid out in organized grids. Major lanes intersected smaller ones. Houses were built of standardized baked bricks. Many had private bathing areas. Some had internal courtyards. Wells were common. Drains ran along streets with inspection covers and careful engineering. Think about what that means. In many ancient cities elsewhere, sewage and water management lagged far behind monument building. But here, everyday urban sanitation appears to have received serious attention. Not just palaces, not just temples, infrastructure woven into ordinary life. Then there is Harappa itself, another great urban center with granaries or large storage structures, craft areas, neighborhoods, and evidence of long occupation. Dhalavira, in today's Gujarat, reveals sophisticated water reservoirs and urban planning adapted to arid conditions. Ladal has been associated with maritime trade and a dock-like basin. Ganarawala, Rakhigarhi, and many other sites expand the map further each decade. This was no single city-state. It was a civilization of networks. Its fingerprints appear in remarkable consistency. Standardized weights suggest regulated exchange. Brick ratios repeat across distant sites. Craft traditions show shared methods. Seals bearing animal motifs and short inscriptions appear widely. Beads, shellwork, metallurgy, ceramics, textiles, and trade goods point to skilled specialists and interconnected economies. Some goods traveled far beyond the Indus world. Harappan materials reached Mesopotamia, where ancient texts may refer to a distant land called Malaa, often linked by scholars to the Indus region. Imagine merchants crossing sea and land routes carrying timber, carnelian beads, cotton textiles, metals, oils, and stories from cities thousands of miles away. This was not an isolated society waiting to be discovered by others. It was part of the Bronze Age world. It feels profoundly different from Egypt or Mesopotamia in one striking way. Where are the kings? In Egypt, rulers carved their names into stone beside giant monuments. In Mesopotamia, kings boasted in inscriptions about wars and temples. In the Indus cities, we do not find obvious royal tombs on the same scale, triumphant conquest inscriptions, or giant statues announcing dynastic glory. There may have been elites and hierarchies, almost certainly there were, but the symbols of power look different, subtler, or remain unrecognized. That difference has inspired decades of debate. Was authority decentralized? Were merchant groups influential? Did ritual specialists govern alongside civic administrators? Were there kings whose palaces we have failed to identify? Did power rotate, disperse, or operate through institutions unlike those familiar from neighboring civilizations? We do not know. And we do not know because the script remains undeciphered. This is one of the greatest intellectual frustrations in archaeology. Hundreds of inscriptions survive, usually short, often on seals, tablets, pottery, tools, or other objects. The signs are elegant and compact. Some recur frequently. Patterns exist. Statistical studies suggest structure rather than random marks. But most inscriptions are brief, and without a bilingual key like the Rosetta Stone provided for Egyptian hieroglyphs, certainty remains elusive. Many scholars believe the signs in code language. Others have questioned whether the system functioned like full writing or something more limited. Multiple decipherment claims have been proposed over the years. None has one broad scholarly acceptance. So the seals continue to stare back at us. A unicorn-like creature, a bull, an elephant, a rhinoceros, a seated figure, signs arranged above them, meaning suspended just beyond reach. Imagine discovering an entire civilization's filing cabinets while lacking the key to the labels. That is where we stand. And then there is the other great question. What happened? Because around 1900 BCE, many major urban centers of the mature Harappan phase began to transform. Not everywhere at once, not necessarily through one dramatic catastrophe, but the great city system changed. Some settlements shrank. Urban planning loosened. Standardization declined. Trade patterns shifted. Populations dispersed into smaller communities or moved eastward toward other river systems. For older generations of scholars, a dramatic invasion once seemed tempting. For a time, simplistic theories imagined outside warriors sweeping in and destroying the civilization. These ideas have largely been rejected or heavily revised. Evidence does not support a neat story of sudden annihilation by one invading force. Reality appears more complex. Environmental change is a major candidate. Rivers in this region have always been dynamic. Channels shift, flood, dry, migrate, and transform landscapes over time. If river systems that supported agriculture and transport changed course or became less reliable, urban life would suffer. Climate stress may also have mattered. Some studies suggest weakening monsoon patterns in certain periods. Reduced rainfall can reshape harvests, water supply, pasture use, and settlement viability. Trade disruption could compound pressure. If long-distance exchange with Mesopotamia and other regions weakened, specialists and urban economies may have lost important supports. Social reorganization likely played a role as well. Large cities require coordination, labor management, dispute resolution, and trust. If those systems strain under environmental and economic stress, people may choose smaller, more flexible lifeways. Again, the familiar lesson returns. Civilizations often do not fall like statues pushed from pedestals. They unravel through many threads at once. Imagine life in Mohenjo-Daro during difficult years. A well yields less water. Flood damage remains unrepaired longer than before. Merchants comprennent fewer goût d'arrive. Neighborhood drains clog. Local leaders argue over labor obligations. Families consider relatives in smaller settlements upriver. One household leaves, then another, then another. Notre rampit announces collapse. The city simply becomes less worth staying in. This may be harder for us to grasp because modern minds love endings. We want a final battle, a burning palace, a date in bold print. But one of history's deepest truths is that worlds can disappear quietly. A child born in a shrinking city may not know she lives in decline. She only knows that streets are emptier than her grandparents remember. What happened after the urban phase matters just as much. The people did not vanish in a thin air. Descendant communities continued across the region in changing cultural forms. Farming continued. Crafts continued. Traditions adapted. Populations mixed and moved. South Asian history did not reset to zero. It evolved through continuity and transformation. But the great standardized urban civilization we call Harappan ceased to exist in its earlier form. And because its script remains unread, we are denied the inner narrative of that transition. We can infer diet from teeth. We can infer migration from isotopes. We can infer trade from materials. We can infer craft from debris. But inference is not testimony. We cannot read a mayor's complaint about flooding. We cannot read a merchant's letter about missing cargo. We cannot read a poem mourning departure from ancestral streets. We cannot read a law code, a myth, a tax receipt, a love note, a child's lesson, a prayer. All may once have existed. If written on perishable materials, they may be gone. If encoded in symbols we still cannot unlock, they are present yet inaccessible. That combination, presence without comprehension, is what makes the Indus world so haunting. And the cities themselves challenge old assumptions about what early civilization had to look like. Many textbooks long centered kings, warfare, temples, and conquest as the obvious markers of complexity. Yet the Indus Valley suggests another model where standardized civic planning, trade, craft production, and water management may have been more visibly central than royal self-glorification. Perhaps power was exercised differently. Perhaps prestige was expressed differently. Perhaps we were looking at complexity through the wrong lens. Even burial practices raise questions. Harappan graves generally do not display the extreme wealth differences seen in some ancient societies. Does that imply relative social moderation? Or have richer burials simply not survived or been identified? Debate continues. Every answer opens another door. Modern archaeology keeps expanding the story. New sites are found. Old chronologies are refined. Ancient DNA studies, environmental reconstructions, residue analysis, microscopic ore patterns, and satellite imagery all add detail. Yet the largest barrier remains language. Somewhere inside those signs may lie names for rivers now renamed, offices now forgotten, gods now unrecognized, neighborhoods now anonymous, and explanations for changes we still debate. Imagine if future archaeologists uncovered our cities but could not read any alphabet. They might map highways, apartment blocks, sewer systems, ports, factories, data centers. They might know we were numerous and organized, but would they understand humor, anxiety, politics, love, identity? Would they know what we feared losing? That is our relationship to the Indus Valley. We see the shell of intelligence and the architecture of daily life. The interior remains dim, and yet perhaps there is beauty in that silence. It reminds us that history is not owned by those best at self-advertisement. Some of humanity's greatest achievements were built by people who did not carve endless boasts into mountainsides. Their cities were real whether or not we can read their signatures. Millions live there. Children ran through brick lanes. Craftsmen drilled beads with patient hands. Water splashed in courtyards. Merchants weighed goods on balanced stones. Families climbed roofs at dusk. Someone laughed. Someone grieved. Someone looked at floodwater rising and worried about tomorrow. Those lives deserve to be imagined not as blank data points, but as human lives equal to any pharaoh's court. The Indus Valley is not merely a puzzle to solve. It is a warning against arrogance. We assume that if something mattered, it would be obvious to us now. But entire civilizations can remain partly unread while their streets lie open to the sky. What else have we misunderstood because it does not resemble the stories we expected? And beyond the deserts of South Asia, across savannas, forests, river kingdoms, and caravan routes, lies another vast region whose past was not lost by accident alone, but often ignored, distorted, or deliberately minimized by those who came later. When many people imagine ancient history, their minds leap automatically to Egypt, Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia, perhaps China, or the Maya. Maps in school books often train generations to look northward and eastward for civilization, as if history radiated from only a few favored centers while the rest of the world waited in shadow. Few misconceptions have done more damage, because beyond the Sahara, across the Sahel, through the Nile Valley, along the Swahili coast, around the Great Lakes, through Ethiopian highlands, forests, savannas, and river basins, societies were building states, trading across continents, forging metals, shaping landscapes, creating art, and producing intellectual traditions long before many outsiders bothered to notice. Some of these histories were lost through time, as all histories are. Others were hidden by something harsher: dismissal, conquest, slavery, colonial myth-making. Archives written by strangers who misunderstood what they saw or preferred not to understand it at all. To step into Africa's historical gaps is to confront not only what vanished, but what was pushed aside. Begin with a simple fact. Humanity itself begins in Africa. Our species emerged there. For vast stretches of prehistory, every human story on Earth was an African story. Yet when written narratives of civilization were later assembled, Africa was often reduced to a prologue, as if once humans spread outward, the continent that birthed them somehow stopped making history. It never did. Consider Nubia and the kingdoms south of Egypt. For thousands of years, the Nile did not end at Egypt's southern border. It continued into lands of powerful states, often called Kushite or Nubian, in different periods. These kingdoms traded gold, ivory, incense, cattle, ebony, and ideas. They fought Egypt, allied with Egypt, absorbed Egyptian influences, and reshaped them into distinct traditions of their own. At times, rulers from Kush conquered Egypt itself. The 25th dynasty, often called the Nubian dynasty, saw kings from the south rule as pharaohs over a reunited Nile realm. They built monuments, revived traditions, and wielded imperial power. Yet in many older narratives, they appeared only as footnotes. Why? Because later scholars trained to center Mediterranean histories often looked past them. Even the pyramids of Nubia, more numerous than those in Egypt, though generally smaller, remained unfamiliar to millions who could easily recognize Giza. Then there is Meroe, capital of a later Kushite kingdom. Their iron production flourished. Trade connected interior Africa to the Red Sea and beyond, and a writing system known as Meroitic emerged. Much of that script remains only partly understood. Imagine that. Another African civilization speaking to us in symbols we still cannot fully hear. A kingdom with monuments, industry, diplomacy, and its own written voice, and large portions of that voice remain locked. Move westward into the Sahel, where grasslands south of the Sahara became corridors of exchange linking North Africa to sub-Saharan worlds. Here rose the great empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. Not modern Ghana, but an earlier kingdom remembered through Arabic sources and oral traditions. These states grew wealthy through trade in gold, salt, cola nuts, slaves, textiles, and other goods moving along trans-Saharan routes. Camels transformed those routes much as ships transformed seas. Caravans crossed immense distances carrying not only goods but scholars, law, architecture, religion, and political ideas. Then came Mali. Its most famous ruler, Mansa Musa, became legendary for wealth after his pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century. Chronicles describe gold distributed so lavishly that markets felt its impact. But reducing Mali to one rich king misses the deeper story. This was a state capable of administration across vast territory. It supported cities such as Timbuktu and Djenné, where scholarship, trade, and urban life flourished. Manuscripts were copied. Law was debated. Astronomy, theology, grammar, and commerce intertwined. Libraries existed in forms outsiders later underestimated. Yet many still grew up hearing Africa had no written intellectual tradition before colonial rule. The manuscripts of Timbuktu alone expose that lie. Thousands survived despite war, climate, theft, neglect, and danger. Fragile pages preserve legal opinions, business records, poetry, medicine, mathematics, and correspondence. They remind us that archives need not resemble European stone libraries to be real. And how much has been lost? How many collections perished in fire, humidity, conflict, or simple disregard? How many local chronicles were never copied enough times to survive? How many scholars' names vanished because those preserving global memory did not think to include them? Travel farther east to the Horn of Africa. There stood Aksum, one of the great powers of late antiquity. Based in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, Aksum minted coins, built monumental stelae, traded with Arabia, India, and the Mediterranean, and adopted Christianity early in its history. Foreign writers recognized it as a major state. Yet outside specialist circles, it remains far less known than Rome or Persia. Why should an empire with coinage, architecture, inscriptions, maritime trade, and global ties be considered obscure? Again, narrative habit matters. Aksum also reveals another pattern of historical shadow. Environmental and political transformation can shift centers so thoroughly that later ages forget earlier greatness. As routes changed and power moved, the memory of what once stood can narrow to legend. Then there's Great Zimbabwe. Few examples better expose deliberate distortion. Between roughly the 11th and 15th century CE, in southern Africa, stone builders created an extraordinary urban center with dry stone walls rising in elegant curves without mortar. Towers, enclosures, elevated spaces, and surrounding settlements formed the heart of a powerful polity linked to regional and Indian Ocean trade networks. Gold and ivory moved outward. Imported goods moved inward. When European colonizers encountered these ruins centuries later, many refused to believe local African ancestors had built them. Alternative fantasies were invented. Phoenicians, Arabs, lost tribes, anyone except the people whose descendants lived nearby. Why? Because acknowledging African statecraft and engineering threatened racist ideologies used to justify conquest. So evidence was twisted. Archaeology was politicized. Truth was delayed. Great Zimbabwe is not only a ruin. It is a case study in how prejudice can manufacture historical darkness. Now follow the coast of East Africa. From Somalia to Mozambique, Swahili city-states flourished for centuries through maritime trade across the Indian Ocean. Kilwa, Mombasa, Lamu, Zanzibar, and many others linked African interiors to Arabia, Persia, India, and beyond. Coral stone mosques, merchant houses, coinage, multilingual exchange, and refined urban cultures grew along monsoon rhythms. Ships departed with seasonal winds and returned with the next. Cultures blended. Languages evolved. Swahili itself became a rich Bantu language, shaped through contact and commerce. Yet for too long, some outsiders described these cities as foreign implants rather than African societies engaged in global exchange. Once again, complexity in Africa was explained away as borrowed from elsewhere, as if Africans could trade but not innovate, build but not design, rule but not govern. The pattern repeats, so often it becomes impossible to ignore. But not all gaps come from external distortion. Some come from the same forces that obscure history everywhere. Perishable materials, oral transmission, climate, migration, war, and time. Many African societies preserve memory through oral historians, griots, praise singers, genealogists, elders, ritual specialists. In some traditions, history lived in performance, lineage recitation, epic song, proverbs, and ceremonial narration. These systems could be highly sophisticated, preserving centuries of political memory and moral teaching. Yet scholars trained to privilege writing often dismissed them as unreliable folklore. That too is changing. Oral tradition must be handled critically, yes, but so must written chronicles shaped by bias, propaganda, and omission. Ink does not automatically equal truth. A royal inscription can lie. A colonial report can misunderstand everything. A praise poem can preserve genuine structure beneath symbolism. The wise historian compares sources rather than worshiping one form. Then there are places where archaeology is only beginning to reveal forgotten scale. Across West and Central Africa, earthworks, settlement mounds, terracing, iron smelting sites, and urban remains show deep histories of engineering and organized labor. In Nigeria, The ancient city walls and earthworks of Benin once stretched across astonishing distances. The Kingdom of Benin later became famous for its bronzes, masterworks of casting and court art, many looted during British invasion in 1897. Looting creates another kind of darkness. Objects survive, but context is ripped away. A bronze plaque in a foreign museum may outlive the palace it came from. Yet separated from archives, oral memory, and setting, it tells less than it could. Across the continent, colonial extraction removed artifacts while suppressing institutions that gave them meaning. Even maps helped erase. Borders drawn in distant conference rooms sliced through older political landscapes, kin networks, trade zones, and ecological realities. Future generations inherited states whose boundaries reflected imperial bargaining more than historical continuity. Then came the lazy phrase, tribal Africa. How much complexity disappeared inside those two words. Kingdoms, republics, federations, city-states, pastoral confederacies, sacred monarchies, merchant oligarchies, age-grade systems, clan networks, legal traditions, diplomatic protocols, taxation systems, and philosophical schools, all flattened into caricature. To recover hidden African history is therefore not just to discover ruins. It is to unlearn inherited blindness. Still, the continent's past also contains mysteries no politics alone can solve. How exactly did certain migrations unfold over centuries across immense distances? How many urban centers remain unexcavated beneath modern settlements or forests? What knowledge systems vanished during slave raids and demographic upheaval? How many languages disappeared before they were documented? What medical, agricultural, or astronomical traditions were never recorded in forms outsiders recognized? What local archives were burned in wars no global textbook mentions? Imagine a scholar in Timbuktu carefully copying a legal text while drought threatens crops. Imagine a caravan leader reading stars over dunes. Imagine an iron worker tending furnaces whose techniques will later be dismissed as primitive by those unable to reproduce them. Imagine a queen negotiating alliances remembered only in fragments. Imagine children playing in the shadow of great Zimbabwe's walls, never suspecting future strangers will deny their ancestors built them. These lives are not side notes. They are central chapters in the human story. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson here. Absence in mainstream memory does not equal absence in reality. Sometimes it means memory itself was organized around power. The shadows over Africa were not always natural shadows. Some were cast, yet they are thinning. Archaeology grows. Manuscripts are studied. Oral traditions are respected with new rigor. Languages are analyzed. Museums face questions of restitution. Schoolbooks slowly change. Digital archives reconnect scattered knowledge. Young scholars across Africa and beyond are rewriting narratives once written without them. The work is unfinished, but the silence is breaking. And as it does, another astonishing story waits farther out across the largest ocean on Earth. A story of navigators who crossed vast waters to settle thousands of islands with no metal compasses, no modern charts, and no written manuals we can fully rely on. They mapped the sea in memory. Then much of that knowledge faded into legend. Stand on a beach at night with no city lights behind you. The horizon is black. The wind shifts softly across the water. Stars burn above in numbers most modern eyes never notice. Somewhere beyond that darkness lie islands so small they cannot be seen from even a short distance away. Between you and them stretch hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles of open ocean. Now, imagine stepping into a wooden canoe and choosing to sail there on purpose. No engine, no satellite, no printed chart, no radio, no estil hui, no rescue service. Only wood, fiber, sailcloth, food stores, companions, courage, and knowledge carried inside human minds. That knowledge changed the map of the world. Long before European empires crossed the Pacific in armed fleets, seafaring peoples speaking Austronesian languages had already achieved one of humanity's greatest expansions. Over centuries, they moved from island Southeast Asia into remote Oceania, settling immense distances across the Pacific. They reached places such as Samoa, Tonga, Tahiti, Hawaii, Aotearoa New Zealand, Rapa Nui, and many others. They connected archipelagos scattered like stars across an ocean covering a third of the planet. This was not drifting by accident. It was exploration, adaptation, and sustained navigation of the highest order. Yet for a long time, outsiders struggled to believe it. Some early scholars proposed absurd theories that Polynesian monuments or societies must have been founded by lost Europeans, wandering Egyptians, South Americans, or mythical strangers. Why? Because they underestimated indigenous intelligence and could not imagine non-Western peoples mastering such vast seas. But the evidence is clear. Pacific peoples were the navigators. The ocean itself was their archive. To understand the scale of the achievement, consider geography. The Pacific is not a lake dotted with visible stepping stones. It is enormous. Many islands are tiny targets hidden beyond the curvature of the earth. Winds variseasonali. Currents shift. Storms can erase certainty in a single night. Fresh water is limited. Food must be managed carefully. Boats must survive repeated voyages. Social systems must support planning, training, and risk. And yet they did it. How? Part of the answer lies in vessels themselves. Double-hulled canoes and outriggers, built with deep environmental knowledge, could be fast, stable, and seaworthy. They were engineered from local materials using techniques refined across generations. Lashings flexed where rigid nails might fail. Hull shapes match conditions. Sails harness prevailing winds with surprising efficiency. These are not primitive rafts. They were technologies perfectly adapted to purpose. But boats alone do not find islands. Navigation did. Traditional Pacific navigation used an astonishing combination of observation, memory, and embodied skill. Stars rose and set in known patterns. Swell directions could reveal distant weather or land effects. Birds followed routines between sea and shore. Cloud formations changed above islands. Reflected light, floating vegetation, drifting logs, smells on the wind, and subtle watercolor variations all carried information. To an untrained passenger, the sea looked empty. To a master navigator, it was crowded with signals. Some traditions described star paths and directional houses. Others used teaching devices, such as stick charts in Micronesia. Not maps carried on voyages, so much as tools for understanding wave interactions and island relationships. Knowledge was often transmitted orally through apprenticeship, chant, practice, and long discipline. Imagine memorizing not a route on paper, but a living system of sky, wave, season, and expectation. Then imagine carrying that system accurately enough to guide families across ocean voids. This was science without laboratories, mathematics without written equations, cartography without parchment. And because it often lived in memory, much of it became vulnerable when societies changed. That pattern should sound familiar by now. Knowledge tied to institutions can vanish if institutions break. Knowledge tied to specialists can vanish if specialists are lost. Knowledge tied to oral transmission can thin if chains of teaching are interrupted. The Pacific offers both triumph and fragility at once. Take the settlement of Hawaii. Reaching the Hawaiian Islands required voyages across immense stretches of ocean from other Polynesian centers. Settlers brought plants, animals, tools, language, and social traditions. They built new societies in volcanic landscapes unlike previous homes, adapting agriculture, religion, and governance over generations. Or Aotearoa New Zealand, among the last major landmasses settled by humans. Polynesian voyagers reached these islands and became the ancestors of Maori communities, developing distinctive culture in cooler climates with new resources and challenges. Or Rapa Nui, one of the most isolated inhabited islands on Earth. There, people built the famous Moai statues whose transport and meaning still inspire debate. For years, popular myths framed the island as a cautionary tale of self-destruction through reckless ecological collapse. More recent scholarship complicates that story, emphasizing resilience, outside violence, introduced disease, slave raids, and the distortions of colonial-era storytelling. Again and again, simplistic collapse narratives fail when confronted with fuller evidence. Yet there were real transformations and losses too. Inter-island voyaging networks changed over time. Some routes intensified, others weakened. Environmental pressures, warfare, political shifts, storms, or demographic changes could isolate communities that once had broader connections. In isolated settings, technologies and social structures adapted differently. Some traditions flourished locally while long-distance skills narrowed. Imagine descendants on an island generations after regular voyages ceased. The stars are still there, but fewer people know the old names for every path between them. Then came outsiders. European arrival in the Pacific from the 16th century onward introduced trade, missionaries, firearms, new political pressures, and disease. In many islands, epidemics caused catastrophic population decline. Colonial administrations reshaped land ownership, law, language, education, and authority. Mission schools sometimes discouraged older knowledge systems. Navigation traditions were marginalized, romanticized, or treated as relics rather than living expertise. The old masters died. Some apprentices were never trained. Some chants were no longer recited. Some sacred places were renamed. Some genealogies were broken. This is another form of historical darkness. Not ancient mystery, but recent interruption. Yet even here, the story does not end in loss. Across the 20th and 21st centuries, Pacific communities and scholars led remarkable cultural revivals. Traditional navigation was researched, remembered, and repracticed. Voyaging canoes were rebuilt. Crews sailed long distances using non-instrument methods, proving what should never have required proof. The ancestors had known exactly what they were doing. One of the most famous examples is the Canoe of Clee, whose voyages helped revitalize Polynesian navigation and identity. Guided by master navigators, including figures such as Maupielug from Micronesia, crews crossed oceans through stars, swells, and disciplined observation. Knowledge once dismissed as impossible sailed again before the modern world. That revival carries a powerful message. Sometimes history is not lost. Sometimes it is ignored until descendants insist to be seen. Still, many mysteries remain. How exactly were certain first voyages organized? Were some islands discovered accidentally and then intentionally resettled? How often did long-distance exchange continue after initial settlement in particular eras? What political systems coordinated labor for major canoe building? How were navigators selected, tested, and ranked? How much knowledge varied between archipelagos? Which stories encode environmental data in symbolic form we only partly understand? And how much vanished in the centuries of upheaval after contact? Archaeology helps. Linguistics helps. Genetics helps. Oral tradition helps. Experimental voyaging helps. But no single source restores everything. Imagine standing beside a canoe under construction centuries ago. Adzes strike wood in measured rhythm. Cordage is twisted by hand. Children watch elders work. Someone recites names of stars. Someone jokes to hide fear of the coming voyage. A navigator studies clouds at dusk and says the season is right. Families load cuttings of taro, yam, breadfruit, coconuts, chickens, tools, water vessels, memory. They are not leaving for a known continent. They are carrying civilization into uncertainty. How many humans have ever done something so audacious? And how many textbooks treated them as footnotes? The Pacific reminds us that intelligence is shaped by environment. Build a society in deserts, and genius may appear as irrigation. Build in forests, and genius may appear as botanical mastery. Build on open ocean, and genius may appear as reading swells in darkness. If we only recognize one form of knowledge, we become blind to most of humanity. It also reminds us that maps can deceive. A modern globe makes islands seem tiny and isolated. But to skilled navigators, the ocean was not empty separation. It was a highway patterned by wind and season, connecting communities through movement. Distance is partly a matter of skill. So is isolation. When those skills weaken, worlds grow larger and lonelier. When they revive, horizons shrink again. There is something deeply moving about that. Ancient voyagers looked into black water and saw pathways. Later generations told those pathways never existed, learned to see them again. The stars had not changed. Only memory had. And memory, once restored, can relight entire civilizations. But before ocean navigators stitched islands into a human network, another civilization along the Nile was preparing to astonish the world with monuments so immense that people would later imagine magic, aliens, or forgotten superscience rather than accept the patient brilliance of organized human labor. Yet even Egypt has shadows, especially in the centuries before the pyramids, when a kingdom was becoming a civilization and the evidence grows strangely thin. Say the word Egypt, and most minds see the same images instantly. Pyramids under a burning sky, golden masks, hieroglyphs carved into stone, pharaohs wrapped for eternity, the Nile cutting green life through desert. It feels familiar, almost overfamiliar, as if ancient Egypt stands among the best documented civilizations on Earth. In some ways, it does. Tombs, temples, inscriptions, papyri, art, royal names, monumental architecture. Few ancient societies left such visible remains. Egypt has captivated travelers, scholars, grave robbers, filmmakers, mystics, and tourists for centuries. Its symbols became global shorthand for antiquity itself. And yet, when we move backward toward the beginning, clarity begins to dissolve. The pyramids at Giza were built around the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE during the Old Kingdom. They did not appear in a vacuum. Structures so massive required mathematics, quarrying systems, labor organization, transport logistics, agricultural surplus, political authority, craft specialization, religious ideology, and generations of accumulated practice. No society wakes up one morning in a village of mud huts and decides to build the Great Pyramid next year. There had to be a long road leading there. But much of that road is fragmentary. That is the shadow. The Nile Valley had been home to human communities for thousands of years before dynastic Egypt. Climatic shifts transformed the Sahara over deep time. Regions once greener became harsher, pushing populations toward the river and its fertile margins. Along the Nile, farming communities developed, exchanged goods, buried their dead with ritual care, and created local identities. Archaeologists identify cultures through pottery styles, grave goods, settlement remains, and regional patterns, Badarian, Naqada, and others. These labels help organize evidence, but they're modern categories imposed on ancient lives that likely felt more fluid and local than neat museum timelines suggest. What we can see is increasing complexity. Villages grew. Craft production specialized. Long-distance trade expanded. Social differences became more visible in burials. Symbols appeared that may foreshadow later writing. Elites emerged. Competition intensified. Somewhere in these centuries, scattered communities along the Nile began moving towards something larger than themselves. Then, around 3100 BCE, or to take the uncertainties of ancient chronology, we encounter one of the most famous transitions in history: political unification. Tradition credits a ruler often identified as Narmer, sometimes linked with Menes in later accounts, with uniting Upper and Lower Egypt. The Narmer palette, a ceremonial object covered in symbolic imagery, is often treated as a key witness to this process. A king wearing different crowns, enemies subdued, divine order proclaimed. But was unification a single dramatic conquest by one great founder? or a gradual process of alliances, wars, marriages, economic integration, and ideological storytelling later compressed into one memorable figure? Probably the second. History loves singular moments. Reality usually prefers messy decades. Even the earliest dynasties emerge through a haze. We have royal tombs, labels, ceilings, cemetery evidence, and scattered inscriptions, but not the kind of continuous narrative later civilizations sometimes provide. Names appear, disappear, overlap, or survive only in later king lists written centuries afterward. Imagine trying to reconstruct the founding of a modern nation from a handful of official stamps, damaged graves, and propaganda monuments. That is often what early Egypt feels like. Yet despite the gaps, the pace of development is astonishing. By the first and second dynasties, rulers commanded labor on large scales. Administrative systems tracked goods and estates. Sacred kingship was taking shape. Artistic conventions emerged with remarkable consistency. Stone architecture advanced. Ritual landscapes expanded. The state was learning to see, count, tax, mobilize, and remember. Then came the Old Kingdom, and with it, the Age of Pyramids. But even pyramids had prototypes. Before Giza, there was experimentation. Mastaba's step forms, changing plans, successes, and failures. The step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, associated with the architect Imhotep, marks a profound leap. Monumental stone construction on a scale not seen before. It did not descend from heaven fully formed. It was part innovation, part culmination. Then Sneferu, founder of the Fourth Dynasty, built multiple pyramids, including projects that seemed to preserve engineering lessons in stone. The bent pyramid changes angle midway, perhaps reflecting structural concerns or revised planning. The red pyramid achieves the classic smooth-sided form successfully. What looks to tourists like static monuments can also be read as a visible record of trial, adjustment, and learning. By the time Khufu's Great Pyramid rose at Giza, Egypt had already spent generations mastering logistics and monumentality. That matters, because whenever evidence is incomplete, fantasy rushes in. People ask whether aliens built the pyramids or lost super civilizations or secret technologies erased by time. But the actual story is more impressive than fantasy. Human beings, organized through institutions, nourished by agricultural cycles, trained in craft traditions, motivated by belief and power, accomplished astonishing things step by step. The real mystery is not magic. It is coordination. How do you persuade, compel, reward, or inspire thousands to quarry stone? Haul loads, feed crews, maintain schedules, align plans, and sustain effort over decades. That question belongs to sociology and politics, not science fiction. And still, many details remain debated. Exactly how are blocks moved in different phases? How are labor forces housed and rotated? What proportion of workers were seasonal agricultural laborers versus permanent specialists? How centralized was control in practice? How did local communities experience royal demands? What did ordinary workers think as monuments climbed skyward? The written record helps, but not enough to answer every human question. Then there is writing itself. Hieroglyphs appear near the dawn of dynastic Egypt, but like many inventions, they do not emerge with explanatory manuals attached. We see developed symbols used in administrative and ceremonial contexts surprisingly early. Did writing arise independently in Egypt, under influence from Mesopotamia, or through a more complex web of contact and parallel innovation? Debate continues. What is clear is that once established, writing became a tool of state power, ritual continuity, and memory. To inscribe a name was to stabilize identity. To record taxes was to extend authority. To carve victories was to shape history. But writing also creates illusions, because literate states preserve elite voices far better than ordinary ones. Pharaohs speak loudly across millennia. Farmers mostly whisper through grain remains, skeletons, broken pots, and footprints in workmen's villages. The poor are everywhere in archaeology and scarce in inscriptions. That imbalance is one of history's oldest distortions. Take the workers who built royal monuments. Older popular images imagine masses of slaves driven by whips. Modern evidence paints a more nuanced picture. Excavations near Giza reveal planned workers' settlements, bakeries, medical care, organized labor groups, and provisioning systems. This does not mean work was easy or society egalitarian. It means reality was structured, complex, and human, not a cartoon. Men got injured. Bread was baked. Tools broke. Arguments happened. Songs were sung. Someone overslept. Someone boasted. Someone died and was mourned. Behind every stone block stood lives rarely named. And then, after centuries of centralized brilliance, the old kingdom weakened. Royal authority fractured. Climate stress may have played a role. Provincial elites gained power. The first intermediate period followed, a time once portrayed as chaos, though modern scholars often see regional resilience alongside political fragmentation. Again, the pattern returns. Civilizations do not simply switch from glory to darkness. They reorganize unevenly. Later Egyptian texts sometimes describe disorder to glorify renewed order under subsequent rulers. Propaganda can make transition look worse than it was. Still, the gaps widen in such periods. Fewer records, more ambiguity, more room for debate. The Egypt we think we know is therefore layered with uncertainty. Even chronology, seemingly straightforward lists of kings and dates, contains disputes, co-regencies, missing years, damaged names, and interpretive puzzles. Ancient scribes themselves curated the past, omitting inconvenient rulers or reshaping sequences for ideological reasons. Memory was political then, too. And what of religion? We know God's names, temple rites, funerary texts, sacred symbols. Yet inner belief is harder to recover. Did ordinary villagers imagine Osiris and Ra the way temple theologians did? How did private devotion differ from official doctrine? How often did people doubt, reinterpret, joke, improvise? No inscription says, "I am confused but try my best." Yet surely someone was. This is the challenge of all ancient history. Monuments survive better than emotions. Even so, Egypt offers extraordinary continuity. Across changing dynasties, invasions, recoveries, and transformations, cultural patterns endured for millennia. That longevity can make the civilization seem timeless, almost outside history. But it was never static. Languages evolved. Art styles shifted. Political centers moved. Foreign rulers arrived. Trade networks changed. Crises came and passed. The Egypt of Narmer was not the Egypt of Ramesses, and neither was the Egypt of Cleopatra. 3,000 years is longer than the span from Cleopatra to us, and yet popular imagination compresses it into one golden blur. Perhaps that is another kind of darkness. Too much fame can hide as effectively as neglect. When a civilization becomes a symbol, its real complexity gets flattened. Still, something deeply moving remains in those early centuries before the pyramids fully dominate the horizon. Picture dawn over the Nile 5,000 years ago. Mist lifts from reeds. Boats slide through quiet water. Accountants tally grain in storerooms. Potters turn clay. A local chief weighs loyalty against rivalry. Stone workers test new methods. Priests rehearse rituals not yet ancient. Children chase each other beside walls their descendants will call old. No one knows they are founding one of the world's most enduring civilizations. They're simply living through change. And that may be the truest way to understand origins. Great civilizations are rarely announced by trumpets. They emerge from countless ordinary acts repeated, refined, and scaled until later ages call them inevitable. But they were never inevitable. They were contingent, fragile, built by people who could fail. Many did fail. Some names vanished. Some experiments collapsed. Some records rotted in mud. Some stories were never written at all. Which brings us to the deepest shadow of all. Because if even Egypt, the civilization of stone and script, contains missing centuries and uncertain beginnings, what about ages before writing anywhere? What about catastrophes before archives? What about worlds erased so early they survive only in climate signals, drowned coastlines, scattered myths, and disputed traces? To reach that darkness, we must go far beyond kings and pyramids. Back nearly 12,000 years, to the end of the Ice Age, to a violent turning point some believe shattered worlds we can barely imagine. Imagine a map of the Earth with coastlines you would not recognize. The Persian Gulf is not yet a gulf as we know it, but a broad lowland crossed by rivers. Vast shelves lie exposed around Southeast Asia, linking islands into larger landmasses. Britain is not fully an island. Between Siberia and Alaska stretches Beringia, a land bridge and ecological zone connecting continents. Shorelines sit far beyond their modern edges because so much water is locked in ice. Now imagine living there, not as a nameless caveman in animal skins from old cartoons, but as a fully human person with language, memory, family bonds, spiritual ideas, practical intelligence, and generations of inherited knowledge. You know migration routes, seasonal plants, fish runs, dangerous weather, animal behavior, tool-making, social obligations, stories tied to landmarks. Those landmarks are about to drown. Around the end of the last ice age, global climate changed dramatically. Glaciers retreated. Temperatures rose overall, though not smoothly. Sea levels climbed over millennia, in pulses and pauses, eventually inundating enormous coastal zones where many humans likely lived. Rivers shifted. Ecosystems reorganized. Animals moved or vanished. Entire ways of life had to adapt. And because this happened before widespread writing, much of it passed without chronicles. No historian stood on a cliff recording the day the old shoreline vanished. No archivist listed the villages abandoned. No census counted the displaced. Yet the scale of transformation may have been among the greatest humanity ever experienced. This is where evidence becomes both tantalizing and dangerous. Tantalizing because real climatic upheaval and drowned landscapes invite profound questions. Dangerous because uncertainty attracts fantasy. Some claim advanced global civilizations with lost super technology were wiped out in a single cataclysm. Others insist every myth of flood or destruction must describe one literal event. Still others dismiss all speculation entirely, imagining prehistoric humans as too simple for complex social worlds. Reality is likely more interesting than both extremes. We know late Pleistocene and early Holocene humans were behaviorally modern. They created art, sewed, clothing, built watercraft in some regions, hunted strategically, managed landscapes, exchanged materials over distance, buried the dead, and transmitted rich symbolic cultures. Complexity did not begin with cities. But complexity is not the same as Atlantis. Small-scale societies can possess extraordinary knowledge without stone skyscrapers. The first great shadow of this era is coastal loss. Many prehistoric populations likely concentrated near rivers, estuaries, wetlands, and shores where food was abundant and travel efficient. Those are precisely the places now underwater after post-glacial sea rise. Archaeology on dry land, therefore, samples only part of ancient human geography. Imagine future archaeologists studying our world after every coastal city sank beneath the sea, with inland farm ruins as their main evidence. They would misunderstand us profoundly. The same may be true in reverse. How many camps, villages, ritual sites, shell middens, fish weirs, burial grounds, and early settlements now lie beneath continental shelves? We know some do. Underwater archaeology has identified submerged landscapes in various regions, ancient shorelines, preserved forests, and traces of human activity. But the oceans are vast, excavation expensive, preservation uneven, and discovery slow. Most of the drowned world remains unseen. Then there is the Younger Dryas, Roughly 12,900 years ago, after warming had begun, parts of the northern hemisphere suddenly returned to near glacial conditions for over 1,000 years before warming resumed. Temperatures shifted sharply in some regions. Ecologies changed. Human communities faced renewed instability just as they were adapting to earlier changes. Why did this happen? The leading scientific explanations involve disruptions to ocean circulation, especially freshwater pulses affecting the North Atlantic, combined with complex climate feedbacks. But debate continues over details. And around this event grows one of the most controversial hypotheses in popular history: the Younger Dryas impact theory, proposing that fragments of a comet or asteroid struck or exploded over parts of the Earth, contributing to climate change, fires, and extinctions. This remains debated among scientists. Some evidence is cited in support. Other studies dispute interpretations or find alternative explanations. It is not established consensus, nor is it pure invention. It sits in the difficult zone where data, method, and extraordinary claims collide. Why does it fascinate people so deeply? Because it offers a dramatic mechanism for loss. A sky event, a sudden catastrophe, a clean explanation for vanished worlds. But human history is often less cinematic and more relentless. Repeated stress, migration, adaptation, partial collapse, resilience, and gradual forgetting. Even without cosmic impacts, the end of the Ice Age was dramatic enough. Consider megafauna extinctions. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and many other large animals disappeared in different regions around broad windows, overlapping climatic change and expanding human hunting. Causes likely varied by place and species, involving combinations of environmental stress and human pressure. For communities tied to these animals economically or symbolically, their disappearance would have transformed life. Imagine inheriting stories centered on creatures your grandchildren will never see. Imagine tools perfected for hunts no longer possible. Imagine sacred meanings attached to migrations that cease forever. Now think of Doggerland. Today, the North Sea separates Britain from continental Europe. But after the Ice Age, lower seas exposed a rich landscape of rivers, hills, marshes, and plains connecting them. Humans lived there for thousands of years. As waters rose, Doggerland gradually shrank, though perhaps punctuated by dramatic flooding events, such as the Storegga tsunami triggered by a submarine landslide off Norway around 6,200 BCE. The homeland became seabed. Fishing boats now sometimes dredge ancient bones, peat, an artifact from places once walked by people whose names we will never know. That image is haunting, history hauled up accidentally in nets. Or consider Sundaland, the exposed shelf of Southeast Asia when sea levels were lower. Regions now separated by sea were once linked more extensively, shaping migrations of plants, animals, and humans. As waters rose, landscapes fragmented into islands, altering routes, identities, and possibilities. The map itself changed beneath people's feet. How many oral traditions preserve memories of such transformations in symbolic form? Flood myths appear across many cultures. They are not all records of one global deluge, nor should they be dismissed as meaningless coincidence. Human communities repeatedly experience devastating local floods, river disasters, tsunamis, storm surges, and long-term shoreline change. Water is among history's greatest authors. Memory often stores trauma in story. A tale of ancestral land swallowed by sea may compress generations of retreat into one dramatic narrative. That does not make it false. It makes it human. Then there is Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, a site that startled the world when monumental stone enclosures dating to the early Holocene were excavated. Massive carved pillars raised by hunter-gatherer or early sedentary communities challenged old assumptions that agriculture had to come first before large ceremonial construction. Apparently, people could gather, organize labor, and build symbolically powerful spaces earlier than many expected. What else did we underestimate? How many sophisticated social experiments left little trace because they used wood, earth, fiber, and memory instead of durable stone? How many seasonal aggregation centers came and went for centuries unnoticed beneath fields? How many ritual landscapes remain buried, submerged, or misidentified? Prehistory often appears simple only because evidence is sparse. The people were never simple. They loved, feared, planned, argued, taught children, honored the dead, and debated choices whose consequences reached millennia forward. Should we move camp north this year? Should we trust rumors of better hunting beyond the ridge? Should we marry into that neighboring band? Should we remain by the old bay though the water keeps rising? These decisions, multiplied across generations, shaped the peopling of continents. And then came farming. In several world regions after the Ice Age, humans gradually domesticated plants and animals, settled more permanently, and eventually built villages, towns, and states. But this transition was not a single revolution everyone embraced overnight. It unfolded unevenly across centuries and millennia. Some groups farmed early, some mixed strategies, some resisted, some returned to mobility, some flourished, some suffered disease, hierarchy, and labor burdens intensified by sedentary life. The old textbook arrow from hunter-gatherer to farmer to civilization is too neat for reality. Still, because writing arrives later in many places, the threshold before text feels like darkness to us. We see bones, pollen, seeds, stone tools, isotopes, ancient DNA, sediments, and ruins. Powerful evidence, but mostly silent about names, jokes, songs, doubts, and dreams. We know someone napped this blade. We do not know what they called the moon. We know a child was buried with beads. We do not know the lullaby once sung nearby. We know forests burned and grassland spread. We do not know who stood watching smoke on the horizon. This is the oldest gap, not merely missing records, but missing voices. And yet there is comfort in that silence too. These people were not waiting for history to begin. They were history. Writing did not create significance. It only changed what survives. The unnamed fisher on a drowned coast mattered as much as a later emperor whose inscriptions fill museums. The mother teaching edible plants on a warming plain shaped the future as surely as any king. The navigator crossing an ice age channel with family in a hide boat was performing a feat no less heroic than armies later celebrated in bronze. Most human greatness was never written down. Perhaps that is the lesson all these shadows have been trying to teach us. We began tonight with collapsed empires, dark centuries, abandoned cities, erased archives, and missing chapters. We crossed the Bronze Age collapse, Rome's fading lights, forgotten Americas, hidden Africa, ocean navigators, early Egypt, and now the drowned worlds before history's first scribes. Again and again, the same truth returned. The past is not a neat line. It is broken, flooded, burned, buried, rewritten, and remembered unevenly. Some stories survive because stone endures. Some because monks copied them. Some because elders kept speaking. Some because deserts preserve what rain would destroy. Some because chance spared a single tablet. And countless others vanished. But vanished does not mean unimportant. It means we inherited only fragments. There is humility in that. The modern world often imagines itself as complete, documented, searchable, stored forever in clouds of data. Yet future silence can begin in a blackout, a war, a flood, a format no longer readable, a language no one teaches, a server farm gone cold. We are not outside the pattern. We are inside it. Someday others may study us through scattered remains and wonder what happened in the gaps. They will see our roads and towers. They will decode some records and lose others. They will misjudge us in ways we cannot imagine. And perhaps, if they are wise, they will remember that behind every ruin were ordinary people trying to live meaningful lives while history moved beneath them like shifting ground. So if the shadows between civilizations feel eerie, let them also feel gentle. They are full of human beings, not ghosts, not mysteries, people. And though most of their names are gone, they were here. If you could stand outside of time and look down at the whole human story at once, it would not resemble the clean timeline printed in school books. It would not be a straight road rising steadily from ignorance to enlightenment. It would not be a staircase where each generation climbs neatly above the last. It would look more like fireflies in darkness. Lights appearing, brightening, connecting, going out, then appearing somewhere else. A city rises beside a river and believes itself permanent. A language flowers across mountains. A library fills with carefully copied thought. Ships cross oceans by memory. Farmers turn dry plains into grain. Stone towers climb toward the sky. Children are born into worlds their ancestors could never have imagined. And then drought comes, or war, or plague, or migration, or complacency, or conquest, or simply time, and the light dims, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. That pattern can feel tragic, but it is also honest, because the true miracle of humanity is not that civilizations fall. Everything falls. Forests burn, mountains erode, stars exhaust themselves. The miracle is that again and again, after loss, people begin anew. They gather survivors. They teach children. They save seeds. They rebuild walls. They rename streets. They invent songs for grief. They carry fragments forward. Every age believes it stands at the end of history or the height of progress. But those who lived in Babylon probably felt modern. So did Roman engineers. So did scribes in Mali, priests in Thebes, merchants in Cahokia, navigators in Polynesia, artisans in Great Zimbabwe, scholars in Constantinople, astronomers in Baghdad, farmers in forgotten valleys no chronicle ever named. They all stood in their present the way we stand in ours. Certain, busy, concerned with tomorrow's weather and taxes and gossip and love, unaware of how future centuries would simplify them. That may be the most intimate bridge between us and the dead. Not monuments, not crowns, not battles. Ordinary worry, ordinary hope. The woman storing grain before winter in a Bronze Age village understood uncertainty as deeply as anyone alive now. The father watching floodwater approach a riverbank settlement knew fear we would recognize instantly. The apprentice learning letters in a Roman town. The sailor scanning stars over the Pacific. The healer gathering herbs in a forest kingdom. The child laughing in a city whose name is now dust. They were not different kinds of humans. They were us in another tense. And if they could speak, perhaps many would say the same thing. We thought our world would last forever too. There's something strangely comforting in that. Modern life often feels loud, urgent, overwhelming. Headlines demand immediate reaction. Technologies change before habits can settle. Crises arrive in waves. We are told constantly that everything is unprecedented. But history whispers another message. Much of what feels final is temporary. Much of what feels stable is fragile. Much of what feels lost can return in altered form. Empires collapse and roads remain. Languages die and their echoes survive in descendants. Books burn and ideas reappear centuries later. Skills vanish and are rediscovered. Peoples are scattered and still remember who they are. Even silence can preserve clues. A buried wall, a seed in ancient soil, a line of poetry quoted by an enemy, a family story repeated by candlelight, a star path taught to one last student. Human memory is stubborn. So is human creativity. This does not mean loss is unreal. Entire archives are gone forever. Whole literatures vanished. Songs ended with a last voice that knew them. Names disappeared from every record. There were injustices never corrected, wisdom never recovered, tenderness no artifact can capture. We should feel that grief. To study history honestly is to accept irreparable absence. But grief is only half the story. The other half is continuation. Someone always picks up what remains. After the Bronze Age collapse, new cultures emerged. After Rome, Europe transformed rather than ended. After epidemics in the Americas, indigenous nations endured. After conquest and distortion, African histories speak louder each year. After suppression, Pacific navigation sailed again. After dynasties faded, Egypt still stood in stone. After the ice age drowned old coasts, humanity built new shores. Again and again, endings became ingredients, not conclusions. If there is a warning in all this, it is not merely that collapse is possible. We already know that. The deeper warning is that arrogance blinds. Civilizations fail most dangerously when they mistake complexity for invincibility, wealth for wisdom, speed for direction, storage for memory, power for permanence. When they stop maintaining the invisible systems beneath visible success. When they assume someone else will preserve the knowledge. When they forget that institutions are made of people, and people can tire, divide, or disappear. And if there is hope, it is not that disaster never comes. It always comes in some form. The hope is that human beings are astonishing adapters. We learn under pressure. We cooperate after chaos. We create meaning from ruins. We tell stories so the next generation starts with more than ashes. Maybe that is why lost histories fascinate us so deeply. Not only because we want to know what happened to them, because we want to know what could happen to us. And because somewhere inside, we sense that our own age will one day become another puzzle. Imagine people thousands of years from now. They uncover foundations of airports and data centers. They find plastics embedded in rock layers. They recover fragments of satellites from silent orbits. They decode some languages, but not all. They know we were many, connected, powerful, divided. They argue over why systems failed or changed. They misunderstand our jokes. They overestimate some leaders and forget others entirely. They know the names of celebrities, but not the kindness of a nurse in a small clinic. They can reconstruct markets, but not friendships. They find billions of images and still cannot tell what it felt like to sit awake at night wondering about the future. They will have their own gaps, their own shadows, their own mysteries, and perhaps one of them, unable to sleep, will listen to a story about us and feel the same mixture of awe and melancholy we feel for those who came before. Because the chain never truly breaks. Even when records fail, influence remains. The unknown farmer changed the soil future kingdoms inherited. The forgotten engineer inspired builders who never knew their name. The unnamed mother. History is usually told like a road. A long road stretching from the first fires in forgotten caves to the towers of modern cities. One step after another. One invention leading to the next. Stone becomes bronze. Bronze becomes iron. Villages become kingdoms. Kingdoms become empires. We imagine progress as something steady, almost natural, as if once humanity learns something important, that knowledge can never truly be lost again. But history does not move like a road. It moves like a coastline after a storm. Whole sections disappear. Familiar landmarks are swallowed. What looked permanent turns fragile. What seems certain becomes mystery. And if you stand at the edge of the ancient world and look carefully, you begin to notice something deeply unsettling. Some of the brightest civilizations ever built did not slowly fade. They did not gently pass their wisdom to those who came after them. They collapsed so completely that later generations barely remembered they had existed at all. Tonight we begin with one of the greatest disappearances of all, the Bronze Age collapse. To understand how shocking it was, you first have to understand what the world looked like before the fall. Imagine the Eastern Mediterranean around the 13th century BCE. The sea is crowded with merchant ships. Ports are full of voices speaking many languages. Bronze weapons gleamed in palace armories. Scribes bend over clay tablets, recording shipments, taxes, marriages, treaties, grain, cattle, copper, tin, olive oil, perfume, slaves, tribute, and war. This was not a primitive world. It was organized, wealthy, international.